Sarah's joining us today from the University of Regina here in Canada, and we will have you introduce yourself. Thank you.
Hi everyone. My name is Sarah. I'm a lecturer here at the University of Regina. It's been a pleasure being here today. I've learned a lot that I'm hoping to take to my classes as well. And I'm going to share my screen for my first presentation. Can, um, just give me a second. So I'm just trying to figure out. Okay, I'm just gonna for a second. I'm still getting used to Teams versus Zoom. Um, okay, that says present in Teams. No, can't share. Okay, I think that's that. I think that's sharing now. Is that
Yes, we can
sharing?
see it. Yes, Sarah, we can see it.
Okay. Thank you so much, everyone, again. My first presentation will be about enhancing engagement in an asynchronous online environment. And this is a strategy I used in a course that I would like to share. Outline today, we'll be focusing on the background, the context, why I decided to make some changes to the course. I'm going to share what the newer course looked like and some of the outcomes that I saw with respect to that change. So just a brief context of the learner. So this is a course on family health in nursing. This is the third year nursing course. Students are expected to explore family health in the context of social cultural factors, the environment, the political landscape, and they're to bring that into their clinical practice in terms of advocating for family or providing general nursing care for families. As you can see with a course like this, we all belong to a family. To really fulfill the learning outcomes of this course, we needed to really engage with each other, to have conversations so that students can really learn from each other. And this was what I found that was missing in this asynchronous course. So for the students, usually about 42 students in the course, they're in different clinical blocks. So one of the reasons why this course is asynchronous is in their third year, they have 4 6 weeks block. So they take 2 days in obstetrics or mental health or acute care or pediatrics. They're going to clinical simultaneously 2 days a week. They also have a theory component of their clinical course. And they do their clinicals at different days of the week, of course, to adjust for site preferences. So students will be in different blocks every day of the week. So they'll be practically in clinicals to Saturday. Occasionally, they also have clinicals on Sunday. So my students were in different clinical blocks. They also had 2 different sites. So we have 2 different sites at the university. So there was really no way to really facilitate synchronous learning for this course. So this was the original course design that I inherited. So we had the knowledge translation activities, which was worth 35% of their final grade. And in my section, I introduced weekly forums as well as quizzes, as well as a final reflection and an initial reflection. They also have, as you can see, 2 major papers in this course worth 65% of their final grade. So the issues I saw was that students, so of course in the beginning of the semester, they were all engaged, but as they started to get into their clinical practice, the stress of clinicals, I started to see less engagement in the course. As well, one of the papers were due, I think the first paper was due week 4, week 5. So it turned out to be a paper writing course. So all they did was this paper assignments. Like there was really no focus on the readings. There was really no focus on their prep for the course. It was really, okay, how do I write my paper? How do I get good grades in this paper? The other thing that was happening in the forums was that while students were participating in the forums, it was hard to have a strict deadline for the forums, for the weekly forums. They did have a deadline, but because they were in different clinical placement every day of the week, it was hard to have a major strict deadline. So what I was seeing was that some students were participating in the beginning of the week, and then they would wait till the end of the week for others to participate, and by then they were moved on to the next week. So this is something that we see from conversations at time, what we call a post and forget syndrome. So you just post just to fulfill diligence, and then you move on to the next thing. There was also feeling of isolation for some of the students, a lot of declining engagements, and the students they were not as motivated because again there was no live sessions, so it was hard to keep track of their learnings and their readings for this course. And then the question for me was that, are they truly meeting the course outcomes? Or is this just, like I said, is this just an academic paper and just writing about different things in this course? Or are they really engaging in what it means to care for a family as a nurse? The students also agreed with me, I would say. So here was the feedback I received from the first iteration of this course. So the students loved the forum. They loved the quizzes. They thought it was helpful, but there was a lot of themes about the heavy workload compared, again, because they're taking other concurrent courses that for nursing, if you're a nursing educator, you know that they really focus on those clinical courses more, right? And we have to really encourage them to think about, I think one of the presenters talked about not intangible, but that part of nursing, to really think about that because that's what you need. Anybody can learn the skills, but really it's those other parts that is really truly important to provide true and holistic care to our patients. So in terms of part of the feedback that talks about dialogue, they felt that 54% felt that the course enabled them to engage in dialogue, and only about 21% felt that it enabled them to participate in peer discussions. So this was, again, sort of similar to what I was seeing in the course. So this led me to a course redesign of course, for myself reflecting on the course and what has happened. It felt that it wasn't fair for me to expect, and I think I was a little bit naive to think, well, students would organically form groups and organically participate, right? So it was a little bit naive for me. It also felt unfair for me to expect students to really focus on that learning, focus on that engagement when the environment is not really conducive to that. So that was one of the, again, reasons why I looked into redesigning the scores. So in terms of redesign, a few things I thought about while redesigning. Of course, my learner feedback, again, which I had shared earlier on, was very instrumental. One thing that jumped out from the feedback as well was students actually loved their final reflection video. So they really loved that they were able to finally talk to each other and actually share their experiences in the course. So they really loved that part of the course. Also looking at the community of inquiry model about online classrooms needing to have a teacher's presence, a cognitive presence, and a social presence. So while I was present in this course, I felt that the social presence and the cognitive presence was a little bit difficult to see the way the course was at the time. And it was hard for students to build that sense of community and connection to the course content, which is actually needed if we're learning about family health. The other thing I had to take into consideration was the UDL principle. So having multiple means of representation, having multiple means of engagement for students as well, and multiple means of expression where they can express how they're learning. So the focus was really on the learning rather than the outcome at the end of the course. And my philosophical approach really aligns with a social constructivist learning, as well as with humanistic principles, where I believe it's important for people to learn by having that peer interaction and being able to co-create a meaningful engagement. So those are things that led to a lot of the changes that was made. So this was what the new course redesign now looks like. So I should highlight, while it seems like the knowledge translation activities were only 40%, but what had happened now was quizzes were taken out of that, and quizzes were given their own 25%. So in total, this was about 65% dedicated to their ongoing learning in the course versus the 35%. So trying to advocate with the teaching team to allow for a little bit more flexibility within the sections, a little bit more academic freedom within those sections. I was also able to scale back the academic paper. Of course, while it's useful for students to write papers, there was a lot of issues as well with the papers, not, of course, not excluding the use of artificial intelligence as well. So we're able to kind of scale back the paper so the students can really focus on the learning. And this is what it looked like. So I'm only focusing on a part of the course. There are a lot of changes made to the course in general, but I wanted to focus really on that video reflection piece. So what happened was I decided to introduce a low-tech video assignment using Zoom, or we have what we call Captura, where students can record. So this is free for them. They can record with their phones or their computers, but they had to be in a group and they had to talk to each other and discuss their learning. So in week one, students were encouraged to complete a poll. And in that week, one of the few questions I asked was, what days of the week were they in their clinical placements? What days of the week were they most flexible? Where is their clinical placement? What are they hoping to gain from the course? So sort of got a little bit more understanding of my learners. And this really guided me placing them in smaller groups. So they were in smaller groups of about roughly between 5 to 6 students in a group. Of course, in the beginning, I did a little bit of reshuffling again, just to make sure that students are aligned with hopefully groups that can foster that meaningful interaction for them. So this was what was happening in those groups. So they were into small groups, and then of course they had to submit 4 group video discussions throughout the semester. There was no due dates for these discussions, so it was due at the end of the semester, so the final class. However, with the way the rubric was written, if they waited till the last day of the semester to submit their reflection, they could lose up to 0.5% of 5%. So it wasn't a lot of marks, but this was enough to encourage them to, of course, get things going for them. And they also had to do a final group reflection. The other piece to this, which was again having multiple means where they can express themselves, there was a blog post alternate activity. So for students that couldn't meet with their groups, or perhaps the topic that week was quite sensitive for them, they have a reflective blog post that they could complete. And this had its own different rubrics as well. Again, the caveat being that they also get a little bit of mark deducted if they choose to use their reflective blog post throughout the semester. So again, just trying to discourage again that solo learning, but they had that options as well. And of course, every week had the guided reflective questions for them to think about. And the most important part is they were to tie what they were reading or what they were watching in their materials that week. They had to tie it with their clinical experiences in those other courses. So if they were in obstetrics or in acute care, they were to bring that into their group conversations with respect to how they're applying those principles they're learning in the course into their current clinical placement, or how they intend to apply it in their future clinical placement or their career as a nurse. Of course, they could also share personal experiences if they're comfortable, but again, there was no I did make it clear at the beginning of the semester that you don't have to share if you're not comfortable sharing. So this is what a sample activity looked like. So this, for example, was just one of the questions for that week. They had to, again, like I said, they had to apply what they were learning into their clinical experiences. So they could either use as a small group or they could do it as their personal journal. So the students had a couple ways through which they wanted to do it. Okay. A few considerations with respect to planning a group reflection like this in this type of course, it was important to think about the principles of trauma-informed practice. This course really touches on a lot of sensitive subjects. Again, as nurses, we face a lot of sensitive things. We had to talk about trauma, colonialism, how it affects family structure. So there were a few links on the web page to the counseling services at the university. I actually had a student reach out at the beginning of the course saying, well, this course is going to be traumatizing for me because so and so and so was happening. And I had a conversation with the advisors with respect to how to support the students in the course. Actually, to my surprise, the student actually decided to use a group reflection to actually share some of their experiences rather than using alternate assignments. Of course, it was also important to think of an anti-oppressive framework, so needing to be careful about how students were operating in the groups. So in the rubrics, um, they do have statements related to letting others talk, letting others express themselves. And as I said earlier, this was an individually marked assignment. So even though they were sharing in groups, I was marking the individual. So again, that sort of like took the onus from a student trying to be the one talking, but at the same time, caution students that maybe loved talking more to allow for others to have conversations. They also had to set group rules in their small groups as well to guide them throughout the semester. The workload was also important to think about for the students and from my perspective when setting up this assignment. So again, for myself, I was able to reduce the academic paper component of the course. And in fact, the academic paper they had to write in that section, it was a group paper as well. So they were in their small groups throughout the semester, working on a lot of things together. And for the students, that was less a workload for them because they were not having to, think about a paper or think about writing this. They were all in their small groups sharing those discussions together, and that reduced the workload from the previous session of the course. And then it's also important to have clear rubrics for everything. So the group reflection had clear rubrics, the reflective blog posts had clear rubrics, and those were explained through a video by myself in the beginning of the semester as well. So it's very important that students know what they're being tested. Well, not tested, so they know what they're being assessed on. So in terms of the outcome, sorry, my thing is jumping here. So in terms of the outcome that I saw, so of course in the beginning it was a little bit difficult for the students for two reasons. The first being that they couldn't believe that it was due the end of the semester. So they're like, what do you mean that I can submit at the end of the semester? So they were not used to this. They were not used to having a little bit of flexibility, and in fact a little bit of were reluctant and resistant to it, although at the end of the semester they were quite happy that they had some flexibility. They were also of course worried because of the nature of their clinical placements, being in two different clinical placements. But overall, they were actually able to meet at different points in the semester. So some groups submitted weekly, some groups submitted every 3 weeks. They had their different ways through which they were submitting. And more importantly, I saw a deeper reflection and better integration of what they're learning in their clinical placement and how they're applying the readings in the class to their clinical placement. I also saw them sharing stories from their clinical placement with each other. So for example, if they're in obstetrics right now, the students was going to pediatrics, and then having a student that is in pediatric in the group, they were able to share those resources for the other students that were not yet in pediatrics. So there was a lot of like sharing and meaningful engagement happening in their small groups. It was also awkward in the beginning for them with the video the first week, but again, as the semester went on, it started to become more organic. It started to be less about the mark, and it started to be more about having a rich conversations. And it felt like they actually enjoyed meeting, and they would probably have conversations before they recorded, and they continue the conversations after they recorded. With respect to students, this was also what students alluded to. So this group talked about the engagement in dialogue from the student feedback jumped to 85%. And more importantly, they felt that the course enabled peer discussion, and that jumped from 21% when we were using forums to 72% using a video reflection. And then they also shared some of their reflections with respect to how they felt this course was very relevant to them. And for myself, I saw consistent participation throughout the semester in the course, which was different from what I had seen in previous cohorts. So just wrapping up then in terms of things we need to keep in mind when structuring this type of activity, we do need to have flexibility, but we also need to have structure. So it was important that while they had that flexibility to submit at any point during the semester, they had a little nudge on the rubric to encourage them to perhaps do things a little bit faster, right? So they're not procrastinating. Of course, belonging always fosters engagement for students in a synchronous classroom. While synchronous is very flexible, it's also very isolating for students, and especially when learning courses that needs us to use our experiences. It's hard to just read or watch videos and not share our ideas. So that was important that we're able to do that in those courses. And then finally, even though this was I will call this a formative and summative assessment. So even though it was formative, having grades was able to encourage them to actually participate in this assessment activity, and more importantly, in their learning. Thank you so much for having me. I look forward to hearing what others have used as well in their asynchronous classrooms.
Thank you, Sarah, very much. I think I was wondering if you ever sat in on any of the group discussions or if they ever invited you to join, when they were having a peer discussion.
Yeah, that's a good question. I did put out the